I started researching and writing that since 2012. And it just came out last year. So my main interest and speciality is very much to do with Chinese wine from the production perspective, but also as a consuming market, a very large consumer market. So my interest is really to bridge the communication between the Chinese wine market and the wider international market, to communicate about what's going on in China from a production perspective and also from a consuming perspective. So today it's really my great pleasure to share with you some of the insights, I suppose, about what's happening in China. I'm going to go through some of these slides with you now. Basically, as you can see, my book is called The Chinese Wine Renaissance. So the very first question is, why a renaissance? Because to most people, Chinese wine is a very new and novel product. So why are we talking about a renaissance? So I would like to set up the premise that actually you should consider China as a new old world wine region. A bit like Georgia, Greece and Turkey, that sort of regions who are becoming popular and becoming more widely known by consumers, but they are very much old world rather than new world in the sense that we understand New Zealand, Australia, for example. China is similarly a region with a very long history of winemaking. And by wine, I do mean grape wine, not just rice wine or liquor that people are more familiar with. So the oldest grape or fruit-based wine found in China actually dates back to 9,000 years ago. But more commercialized winemaking started around the Silk Road era. So that was Han Dynasty in the 3rd century BC, when the Han Dynasty envoys went westwards to seek alliances and also trading opportunities. And that's the start of the Silk Road. And Western vine varieties and technology, winemaking technology, came into China from the West in the 3rd century BC. And since then, throughout different dynasties, China has been producing grape wines in various parts in the Central Plain. So this is a map of what's where grapes are grown for winemaking, and you can see, it's a very widespread. It's dotted almost all over China. More importantly, the major regions you can see are the areas with the bigger dots. The bigger dots indicate higher concentration of vine growing for winemaking purposes. The green dots are the European Vitis vinifera varieties, and the red dots indicate local varieties, Chinese grape varieties. So you can see that the main regions that we are interested in these days are mainly Xinjiang to the far west. So the Silk Road, as you can imagine, also came through this region. And now it accounts for around 25% of the wine growing plantation in China. And then here you have Ningxia, that you probably have heard of. Ningxia province also accounts for about 20% of the area under vine for wine making purposes. So Ningxia is the another very prominent region that's coming through. And then you have the eastern coast, Shandong, which is a historic wine growing area. So the first modern industrialized winemaking facility was founded in this Shandong region in 1892. So even the modern Chinese wine industry started in 1892, which is probably a lot older than you imagined. So other important regions we've got these days we have Hebei province just here above Beijing, and Yunnan down here near the Tibetan plateau. We have some good fine winemaking at high altitude around here. And then we also have a lot of ice wine making in the north of China, just above North Korea. And some of them are made with Chinese wild varieties or crossbreeds between Chinese grapes and the European varieties. So you can see the production is really very wide. Lots of experimentations with different grapes and also with different terroirs. As you can imagine, over here, Xinjiang and Ningxia, here you have a lot of desert regions, Gobi Desert. And a lot of the winemaking initiatives are to fight against the desertification around those areas and create jobs in these very remote and traditionally poor areas. And then you have sort of the maritime and monsoon effects on the eastern coast, where the summer you might have monsoon, which might be a problem. So very vast region, lots of different terroirs, different heights. And one of the interesting aspect of Chinese wine growing is that in the winter, in certain regions, as you might have noticed that some of these are quite north, right? A lot of these vineyards are in the north of China. So in the winter, to protect the vines against the cold and also the very dry and cold conditions, the vines needs to be buried by earth so that they can safely survive the winter. So usually around November time, vineyards in the north of China will have to be manually buried with earth, and then they will have to be dug up again in around March time. So although China is very vast, there are not so much like the perfect region where you can have perfect summers and perfect winters. Usually it's a fight. It's a choice. It's a choice between very cold winters where you have to bury the vines, or mild winters but summers with potential monsoon influences. Let me try to slide across. So various wine grapes that are grown in China. So you can see the vast majority is actually Cabernet Sauvignon. This is just for the reason that a lot of new wine regions, they start off thinking they need to produce a good Bordeaux blend, So a lot of planting was traditionally Cabernet Sauvignon, and also Cabernet. Cabernet in China, Cabernet in China has a special name. Okay, my slide is going a bit crazy. Hang on. Cabernet in China has a special name called Cabernet Knish. Let me try to find the right slides to show you. Yeah, so Cabernet, and the reason is, if you remember, I mentioned in 1892, the first industrialized wine facility was set up in Shandong. And the founder imported and experimented with lots of different grape varieties. And he found that Cabernet, which used to be a traditional Bordeaux variety as well, did very well in Shandong province. And at the time, it was called Cabernet Gemischt. Gemischt is the German for mixed Cabernet. But because of a misspelling, this name, Cabernet Knish, which is a misspelling, basically stuck. And now Cabernet in China is called Cabernet Knish. And the other interesting grape that you should know about is Marselan. So despite the fact that a lot of the vineyards are growing Cabernet Sauvignon doesn't ripen very well necessarily everywhere. But Marselan, which is a crossbreed between Cabernet Sauvignon and Grenache, It was a crossbreed initially intended for south of France, but Marcelin has found really interesting expressions in China. So you can see it's a loose bunch, big berries. So even in the eastern parts where temperature can be humid and wet in summer, because of the loose bunching, you can have good ventilations between the bunches. So it's a bit more it's less prone to diseases. And also Marcelin in China seems to be quite expressive. The fruit and the elegance seems to come across much better than in its native south of France. So Marcelin could be the star variety of China in the future, and people are growing more and more of it. And now, in China, they celebrate Marcelin Day, for example, trying to promote Marcelin as the star variety of China. And on the white variety side, so Chardonnay and Riesling are very popular, but also another variety called Longyan, which means dragon eye, is coming into prominence. So Longyan used to be a table grape that was just consumed quite widely in China. But because it's been growing in China as a table grape for a long time, potentially for 800 years, we've got some very old vines. We've got some very old Longyan vines that's starting to make very characterful white wines. In particular, Great Wall Wine Company, based in Hebei, Shachen, they've got some very old 100 to 200-year-old vines. And they're using it to make fairly good quality old vine dry white wine. So Longyan is another variety to watch as something quite typical, quite uniquely Chinese. So in terms of the market, Chinese market tends to throw at you very huge numbers, so largest planting area of Cabernet Sauvignon in the world, the largest global e-commerce market already for wine and spirits. China produces around 600 billion tons of wine a year, so it's already a top 10 producing country. And also now it's like top 2 or 3 in terms of volume of imports and value of imports as well. So it's a huge and important market. But if you consider it in relative terms to its own population and its own domestic market, you can quickly realize that it's a market with a huge headroom for future growth. Because despite the fact that, China has more areas under vine than France, but only 10% of that is actually for wine growing. The rest is still very much for raisins and for table grapes. And also in terms of the number of wineries, there aren't that many, considering how much of the land is planted with wines. There are only around 400 to 500 of these wineries which are consistently producing wine every year and are officially recognized as wineries. And if you look at per capita wine consumption in China, per capita, people only drink about 2 bottles a year versus 28 bottles in UK, 58 in France, that sort of thing. So despite the fact that China is already the #1 e-commerce market for wine and spirits, but to the overall e-commerce market in China, which is worth 7 trillion yuan, only around 70 billion are spent on wine and spirits. So essentially, it's still a market that's very young, with a lot of room for growth as people from not just the first-tier cities, second-tier cities, now the third, fourth, fifth-tier cities are also starting to learn about wine. You can just imagine how big that market could be in the future. So now let's look at back in the UK, what has really been happening. So before COVID-19, really, I think there was a lot of a flurry of activities, especially in the last year or so, in 2018 2019, we've started to see quite a few companies starting to export into the UK. In a way, I was lucky that my book came out last year as well. It just coincided with a lot more wineries from China interested in exporting, and also a lot of wine critics, wine writers in the UK starting to write about China. And these slides just show you a tiny selection, actually, of what you can now get in the UK. And you can see we've got sparkling wines, bottom left corner, a very good vintage sparkling wine made by the Great Wall Wine Company. We've got white wine, rosé, reds, of course, and also ice wines, sweet wines. So you can really build a proper wine list just based on what's available already in the UK from China. In terms of price, this is just to show you maybe the extremes. You can get wines. These are off trade, retail prices. Usually from 10, 12 pounds for like an entry level wine. And the fine wines, boutique winemakers tend to price around 20 to 30 pounds. And then you have, at the other extreme, you've got LVMH and Lafite making fine wines in China, and they sell for around 250 pounds a bottle. So that's sort of the price range you can expect from a retail pricing in the UK. And this is interesting because I think we are very used to having Chinese products flooding a market at a low price end. And that is not the case for wine. It's actually completely illogical for Chinese to export large quantity of cheap wine, because production cost for wine is not that cheap in China. As you can see with the burying, unburying of wines in a lot of these regions, the cost of production, the cost of labor is actually fairly high. And if you think about a French barrel costing maybe, I don't know, 160 euros in Europe, by the time it makes its way to China, it's 3 times that price or more. So equipment, facilities that are exported to China for making wine, and also the human labor cost involved in the vineyards are quite high. So it doesn't really make sense for bulk wine from China to be exported to Europe, for example. So we're really talking about the fine wine market as an exporting market from China. So at the entry level, you are talking about 10 pounds really as a sort of a floor, unless you're doing some supermarket big deal, special offer. I think 10, 11 pounds at the entry level, and then 20 to 30 pounds is probably the sweet spot for the smaller, more boutique type of winemakers, all the way to the really high-end spectrum, LVMH and Lafite, that type of people catering for a different market at 200 to 300 pounds. So if you want more information, you can check out my blog, winepeak.com, where I have a bit more information about stockists, trade and retail, and restaurants. In terms of the on-trade, here are just a selection of restaurants in the UK and also private clubs who have Chinese wines on their list. Again, you can see these are mainly high-end establishments, and you might be surprised that they're kind of restaurants which have very international clientele. They're not just the typical Chinatown restaurants. They're very much international facing clientele, perhaps with a bit of emphasis on Asian cuisine or Asian clients. But most of these places, they tend to have 1 or 2 brands. I think there was a question before about which restaurant has the most comprehensive list of Chinese wines. And at the moment, most of these restaurants are, trying out with one or two brands, maybe a white, maybe a red, just to see how they're doing on their list. With one exception, Lu Ban restaurant, which I was working with last year, I was trying to build a list for them where 10% of their list would be Chinese. So we were really trying to cater for almost a showcase center for different styles of Chinese wine. And I was going to put in a rotational system for them to have different wines by the glass, maybe every month or every once in a while, to have a rotational, like a caravan system. Because I think it's quite important at this point to have wines by the glass for people to try, especially at places like this where if you're not familiar with Chinese wine, you probably don't want to drop 80 pounds or so on a bottle of Chinese wine, but you might be very happy to try a glass for maybe 12 pounds. And actually, by the glass, Chinese wines can offer very good price to quality ratio, and also the novelty factor, the surprise factor for customers when they try a fine Chinese wine that completely exceeds their expectation. That is something that I get a lot of enjoyment out of when I do tastings, to see how people react for the first time to a good glass of Chinese fine wine. So, and this slide is really to show you the different activities that was going on before COVID-19, especially last year. Even for me personally, I've done a lot of events with universities, for example, Cambridge, Oxford, STOAS, LSE. We've done different forums, different talks at these higher educational institutions. For example, if they had a China subject forum, after days of discussion, we would have a wine tasting. We may even do a wine dinner with a Western menu, but served with Chinese wine pairings. And also, I've done some Channel 4 and BBC programs promoting Chinese wines who are exporting to the UK. Corporates are also getting interested in having Chinese wine tastings or Chinese wine dinners for their clients, not just for Asian clients, but also when the topic that they're discussing is China related. And I think that was really the trend we were hoping to build on the back of these exports, on the back of the book, on the back of more press interest as well in Chinese wines, is to build client base, not just from the restaurant side, but also from the event space, from event space, from corporates to the universities, etc. So that was going very well, and it was almost looking like an exponential curve until, of course, COVID hit, and that became, the easiest curve to flatten, of course. And suddenly, I was very busy until Chinese New Year, actually, until February, and then, of course, now that curve has been very successfully and completely flattened. So event space is going to be, of course, very tricky. So what are the trends that we might possibly expect going forward? So for starters, in China already, because they were slightly ahead of us in terms of how COVID was unfolding, so you can already see that in February, people were turning to the clouds, as they call it in Chinese, live streaming of friends gathering and drinking wine, and master classes being delivered online. And we're, of course, seeing a lot of that now over here. And this could potentially be a trend that sticks, because it's actually quite nice and relaxing to drink at home. And you can probably get a lot of winemakers and producers who in usual times might not be able to travel to an event to deliver a talk, but now, you know, through live streaming, suddenly we have access to all sorts of experts from all over the world. So delivering an online masterclass is now actually, you get more freedom than a physical location. So this could be a trend that sticks around. And for China as a market in particular, that could mean quite fundamental shifts in consuming habits, because Chinese people don't usually have the habit of drinking a glass of wine by themselves at home. But if through this crisis, they do start to enjoy drinking at home and drinking you know, with their own dinner at home rather than purely going out and consider drinking as a completely social event, then that would have fairly profound implications to the demand in the Chinese market. You know, if suddenly people are drinking a glass of wine that with the food that they're cooking at home, you know, that could be quite profound. Over here, it could just mean that, you know, people will start to enjoy more ways of drinking at home, maybe with a tutored live streaming session rather than just opening the nearest bottle they can find in the fridge. So that's one trend that could be interesting, both for the Chinese market and for the international market. And of course, the e-commerce. We've seen e-commerce has completely transformed the landscape of how people are shopping, how people are getting wine, buying wine. And in China especially, a lot of the brick and mortar wine stores have just seen their sales completely wiped off, and it's the same here. Well, not to the same extent, because wine shops here are still considered essential services, whereas in China, you know, it was like a 99.99% kill, you know, like Dettol. So a lot of these wine merchants had to find ways to get online. But luckily, in China, because e-commerce is very, very advanced in a way, I would argue e-commerce in China is much more advanced than what we have here. And you have large horizontal, what we call horizontal channels like JD.com, Alibaba. So a lot of wine merchants were able to open their own channels via these big platforms to sell their wines. And they have recorded much better results, actually, or these e-commerce platforms during the crisis. They've seen their sales double or triple in some cases. And also social channels like TikTok, WeChat, where you have these influencers who open up their own channels to promote, to educate, and to sell via these social channels, have been doing very well as well. So e-commerce is definitely something that has been accelerated, you know, and that will still continue after the pandemic as well, and we'll probably see the same over here. This is what I will skip for now because of time. Big data and AI is just, in China, we are seeing the online and offline already starting to merge to give a more seamless experience for consumers. And I think post-pandemic, you're only going to see that accelerate both in China and internationally. And the other thing I want to mention about China as a marketplace is that people really love learning. You know, before maybe up to 2010 and 11, the story about China is very much about speculation, about people showing off wealth and buying all the Bordeaux classified growth, etc. But now that trend has really changed. You know, now you are seeing a lot of people really enjoying wine and learning about wine. And to me, education is really the only effective counterweight to this low threshold counterfeiting in China. You know, as people becoming more aware of what they're drinking, it's going to be harder to sell fake wines. You know, at least it has to be a more sophisticated fake, rather than just things like pen friend instead of penfold, that sort of mistakes, it will that will certainly not be tolerated in the future. And also with the rise of people learning about wine, that's also shaping a little bit of people's taste. In a way, WSET is really teaching about people how to approach wine, how to taste wine. And in a way, that's feeding back to producers in terms of how they also want to strive to make wines that people appreciate. So this is another aspect that's worth watching to see how the education penetrates through the market. Okay, so I'm gonna end on saying that feel free to contact me. I'm on social media, JZ WinePeak. WinePeak.com is my blog, where you'll find lots of different information. So I mentioned the stockist information, but also I've done some programs for BBC and Channel 4 on Chinese wine. You can access those video links from my blog. I also write for magazines like Decanter, Meininger, Wine Business International, Unheard, The Buyer, etc. So some of the contents that I write for them are also available on my blog post as well. And also my book, The Chinese Wine Renaissance, if you want to know more about the background, the history, and also some of the cultural aspects of wine in China, and why I think this is, first of all, a renaissance rather than something brand new. And also, this is something that's not just a novelty factor. Chinese wine will become a trend, It addresses a lot of problems in China itself in terms of poverty alleviation and, sustainability, etc. But also in a global marketplace, it also addresses some of the issues with climate change that you're seeing. In particular, if you notice the ice wine production in China, in the north of China, that could in the future have a great impact on the global ice wine production dynamics, for example. Yep, so I shall end there, and maybe we can do some Q&A, I suppose.
Yes, thank you so much, Janet. And we've got a couple of questions here, and I have got a question from Holly. Okay, so she is, let me have a look. So she's asking, are there protected regions to be looked out for in China? So like, DOP for Italian wine. So are there any AOC
Yes.
kind of system?
Yeah, so we do have appellations already in China. So one of the perhaps the most prominent one is the Ningxia Helan Mountain East. So Helan Mountain East is now an official appellation. So yes, there are several initiatives to qualify different regions in China in the same way that the appellation systems work in Europe. And also there are also like organic certification, that sort of thing. Yeah, so China is very much going in that direction with the exporting market in mind to help international customers to learn about what they're drinking. Yeah.
Okay, we have another one. And so there's a question about what are the pros and cons in stocking Chinese wine if the restaurants do not have any Oriental food.
Yeah. So I personally think having Chinese wine, of course, the Chinese restaurant themselves, I think, especially with the second, third generation proprietors, they are looking into modernizing their wine list, making their offering a bit more internationally minded. And having Chinese wine definitely would help. But if you're not a Chinese restaurant, why should you still have Chinese, for example? For starters, I think in general, not just Chinese food, but food in general. Why? Because Chinese people tend to drink wine with food. So even Chinese producers, when they're making wine, they very much have their drinking habit in mind, i.e., does my wine suit a banquet, And also the vines in China are typically a bit younger. So typically the average age might be 7 to 12 years old vines. So the wines they're making are not super tannic anyway, they're fruit forward. They're easy to drink quite young, so that profile are fairly food friendly by themselves. And also why and the other aspect I think is if your clientele are likely to be Asian, if you expect to have Asian clients or Chinese clients, I think in the future it will become increasing a trend that you would kind of need to throw in a Chinese wine, just to in the sense that if you consider how menus are becoming more and more inclusive and considerate, before you might just have one token vegetarian option. Now you have to cater for vegans. You have to have options for vegans. If you're having tea and coffee, you probably need the green tea and herbal tea, not just black tea, for example. Menus are more aware of allergens, and if you're a UK-based restaurant, you probably want to have an English sparkling wine, not just champagne prosecco, for example. And I think in the future, if you do think your clientele involve Chinese or Asian clients, having a Chinese wine is almost part of that trend. The more inclusive, more considerate, more global type of offering that you might have on your menu, because the quality is there. And I also think if you consider in my slides, I showed you some corporate events, forums where China topics are discussed. I really believe in 1 or 2 years' time, it will become the norm for these forums to be serving Chinese wines. I just can't imagine in 2-3 years' time, if it's an embassy function or if it's a corporate function where they're talking about China or their clients are Chinese, they will still be serving unimaginative bulk wine, from south of France or something. I think it will become almost a glaring faux pas if you're not serving some Chinese wine. So I think it's a bit of a trend as China produce wines at the quality and at the price level that can be competitive internationally. There's no reason why it shouldn't become part of the mix.
Great. I think we just have to, we are overrun a little bit already. So just one last question about Brazil. I think we have many people from different parts of the world today. So I'm not sure if you are able to answer this question live, but the question is Brazil a market for Chinese wine, and what brands can we find there?
Okay, as far as I know, Brazil is not currently an exporting destination for Chinese wines. I might be wrong, but I don't think so. But if I think at the moment, for starters, exporting Chinese wines are not terribly financially viable for a lot of producers at the moment, for the reason we slightly touched upon, costs, competitiveness, etc. So the main exporting markets at the moment is UK, Europe and UK. And I would argue UK is right now the place to try Chinese wines. We have a lot more variety of Chinese wines in the UK than, as far as I'm aware, anywhere else, any other international market. But yeah, if there's an overwhelming reason why Brazilians would love Chinese wines, I'm sure there are some conversation that could be had. Yeah. So the other thing I want to mention briefly is that behind the scenes, before COVID, like I was saying, there was a lot of interest in the event space, but also behind the scenes, we're also forming a generic body, really, to represent wines of China, to act as a single source of resources, of information, and we can sort of offer some impartials and introductions to people outside of China who want to know more about Chinese wines, or want to import, or want to, you know, if just for whatever reason they want to learn about China more. So that's kind of an ongoing project in the background. And although COVID has thrown spanners in the works, but to be fair, if you are interested, if anyone's interested, we can still, to a large extent, do that. You know, we can still put you in touch or suggest stockists for you, etc. So do get in touch if you're interested. The other aspect is education. So last year we are actually in the process of creating almost like a cordon bleu idea for Chinese culinary culture and art. And part of that qualification involves a Chinese wine element. So essentially what we're doing is converting a Chinese culinary qualification from China into an internationally recognized qualification that anybody, you don't have to be Chinese to learn how to become a Michelin chef in Chinese cuisine, for example. But part of that course will also include a Chinese wine component. And actually, Leona, we were talking before COVID that perhaps to get WineEd involved as a distribution for that education, you know, the project as well. But of course, you know, with COVID, that's slightly on hold. But the qualification doesn't have to, there's no reason why people can't learn, you know, during these COVID period. And we're trying to put a lot of the contents as an online delivery, as an online course now. And so that should be available probably later part of the year. Yeah, it should be something that people can start to look into as well. Yeah.
That's great. Thank you so much, Jeanette, and thank you, everyone. And we will, the session is recorded, so it will be available probably tomorrow on our WineEd YouTube. So for those of you who joined us a little bit late and you missed the first part, don't worry, it's all recorded. Okay, and so thank you all very much. And if you want to sign up for our upcoming events and masterclasses, you know where to do. So everyone at wineed.co.uk, that's the email to send. Okay, thank you, Jeanette, once again.
Thank you.
It's a pleasure.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure.
Everyone. Have a lovely day.
Thank you so much. Bye-bye. Thank you. Bye.